Hello. I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of consciousness and what is needed for the transformation of consciousness. And I'm just going to look at the transformation of human consciousness. But I'm just going to say a little bit about what consciousness is to start with. For me, consciousness is something that pervades all that is, that connects everything. None of us are separate. We're all enveloped, as it were, in a field of consciousness. And science has recently proved that consciousness exists beyond the brain. And there have been many cases of people who, for all intents and purposes, have been brain dead, but their consciousness has remained and they've had extraordinary transcendental experiences. And I also want to suggest that just as inside an acorn is oak treeness and the knowledge of how to go through all the different stages of becoming an oak tree, so inside us exists all the knowledge of all the different stages we need to go through to become a fully awakened, aware, enlightened human being. The difference between the oak tree, the acorn and us, and I think lucky old acorn, is that for the acorn it happens naturally. But we poor old human beings, we've got to work for it. We've got to work to extend our consciousness. Because consciousness is not a given. The very interesting thing, and I wrote about it in detail in a chapter in my last book, is that you and I come into the world with who we are hidden inside us. Trailing clouds of glory do we come, Wordsworth told us in his Intimations to Immortality, from God who is our home. Shades of the prison house close around the growing child. In other words, we come into the world, but then we forget that we are divine. We forget that a higher consciousness exists inside us, and we get, as it were, seduced or hypnotized by the conditioning of the society, the culture around us, our families, our race. And so the game of life, in a way, is we come into the world where this knowledge of who we really are and what the real deeper purpose of our life is hidden inside us. And the real game is, are we going to remain hypnotized? Are we going to remain asleep all our lives? Or are we going to wake up and realize who we are? That we are, in fact, a very, very highly evolved person. But if we are to realize that, we need to work at this. So the difference between people, I think, or the greatest difference, is not, between race and if we're rich or poor or black or white or that stuff, but the consciousness levels, because we all exist at different levels of consciousness. For example, Donald Trump, I won't say anything about him because we all know about him, exists at a different level of consciousness than a spiritual master, than Sri Aurobindo, for example. But Donald Trump still has divinity inside him, but it's more locked up, because a Donald Trump, and I'm just using him as an example of all of us, because we all have a bit of us that's Donald Trump, is that he's become seduced by the ways of the world and the pull of materiality and power and fame and glory and everything has got hold of him. So that's the great challenge for you and I as we come into the world. Are we going to remain seduced by our culture and just live an egocentric life where we're just concerned with ourselves and what we want and becoming richer and famous, or, sort of putting others down if they don't enhance what we want? Or are we going to realize that there might be a deeper purpose to our existence, and that we've all come to play out a sacred role in the world? Or, as I explained in my last book, are you and I going to give birth to, that is, work at bringing out the soul inside us? Are we going to put an energy and effort not just into being a famous somebody or earning a lot of money? And there's nothing wrong with that, because we need to earn money. But are we just going to focus on the material side of life, or are we going to try to develop our inner life as well? So I'm saying that the difference between us is really the difference in our consciousness. And my experience is that the lower our consciousness is, or the less evolved you and I are, the more likely we are to be racist and prejudiced and sexist and patriarchal, and to create barriers between ourselves and other people because we believe we are separate. And the story that we come into the world believing, it was certainly a story that I came into the world believing, excuse me, I've got a little bit of a frog in my throat today. And the story that we come into the world believing is that we're separate from our fellow human being, that we're islands unto ourselves, and that there's no higher purpose, that and so anyway, the difference is from a Trump, say, poor old Trump, he gets so much projected on him, but then perhaps he's come into the world. There was a lovely story I heard that there's a Buddha who comes into the world who wreaks havoc and disaster all around him, because he creates so much mayhem that everyone sort of wakes up. They say, we've got to do something about this. And perhaps dear old Trump is this concealed Buddha who's come into the world to remind us of everything that's worst about ourselves, so we sort of hopefully will do something about it. So anyway, consciousness exists at many different levels. It's on a spectrum. And we can say a galaxy has a higher level of consciousness than a glowworm, but both of them have consciousness. So what is necessary if you and I are to expand our consciousness, become more self-aware? Well, I think the first thing is that we realize the incredible damage that we do our world through our unconsciousness. Most of the evil that exists is because we are unconscious, or as Jesus says, forgive them, they know not what they do. And I'll just give you one example. Tony Blair took England to war against Iraq, where 500,000 people died. Because he was unconscious that there was a big narcissistic part of him, that he unconsciously wanted to be loved and feted as a great hero, and to be patted on the back by George Bush, the American president. So he went along with this. Had Blair been more conscious, had Blair had more self-awareness, had he known his personality, vulnerabilities, his dark or his shadow side better, he would have said, I can see that there's a deeper unconscious motivation that makes me want to go to war, and he would have done something about it. So that's a really good example. And we see that the more we're in power in the world, the more important it is that we become more self-conscious. Too much damage is done by our unconsciousness. And another example is when we put people down, when in our minds we hold that we're superior to someone else, we're richer than them, or we're racist, or we're misogynist, we're projecting out stuff inside us which actually, just like a sort of dark net, can entrap other people. And as I speak, we have all these riots going on for against racism. Racism is a real example of unconsciousness. And as Martin Luther King said, a wonderful thing, he said, the white people expect, and I'm quoting Martin Luther King, the white people expect the Negro, because that's the word that was used in the 60s, expect the Negro to pull himself up by his own boots. But if those boots have been taken away from him, what can he do? And so, in a way, this march on behalf of ending racism is a real triumph of a movement forward in consciousness. Because I repeat, too much damage is done in the world by you and I being unconscious of what our thoughts are doing to others, of what the superficiality of our lives and the effects that this has. We don't know, we're not conscious of the fact of the damage we do to our planet through our thoughts, through our investment in firms that devastate rainforests or that create sort of plastic sort of packaging. So the more aware we become of all these things, the more we limit the damage done in the world. So it's a really important point that humanity needs to become more conscious. And this is what is going to save our planet. Our planet is not going to be saved just by new policies being enacted if we play out the new policies in our own unconscious ways. The great thing that is needed in the world is for you and I to grow in our consciousness. So realizing our unconsciousness is my first point. My second point is that we need to realize the huge gains that can be made by becoming more conscious, by by becoming more conscious and doing practices to increase our conscious, like meditation, for example, can do incredible things for us. It can make us feel calmer and happier. Tumors can be released. Blood pressure becomes normal. Heart life improves. We age more slowly. We feel more exuberant. And the Desert Fathers, for example, who lived in the desert and ate very little food, they did incredible spiritual practices of prayer and meditation, and they had huge exuberance and joy, and they lived very full and lives into their 90s, and some were over 100, and they lived vigorously all their lives, because that's the power that consciousness can have. And when you and I spend time in doing things to grow our consciousness, then we're also growing our humanity. We're giving birth to the deeper part of ourselves that, as I said earlier, has been hidden inside us. And so it's very important that as we expand our consciousness, that we hold images of who man can be, new images of what it means to be human, other than the images that we need to be a pop star or extremely rich or a top model. I'm not saying that these are bad people in any way, but I think that we need new images to live up to of people who are conscious, and they are not the people who are sort of fashionable. They're not the people who get written about in magazines. So that's the power and the importance of becoming more conscious. So what helps us become more conscious? Well, my friend, I think it's dissatisfaction with our lives as they are. We don't like our lives. We're not happy. We feel something's wrong. We sense there's more dimensions to us than just being a consumer and trying to get rich. So then we realize there's something wrong. I want to do something to change my life. And that spurs us on to be on a path of enhancing our consciousness. Another important thing is shock. Gurdjieff, a teacher in the early part of the 20th century, he said that man, being the inert, lazy old devil that he is, he needs a shock bigger than the sum of his inertia to wake him up. In other words, we need a rocket up our backside, because that helps to wake us up. And I think that this coronavirus is that shock, because it's a real sort of wake-up call. Because in helping us confront death, we're also asking, that we might physically die, our old lifestyles may need to die, our jobs may die. We're asking, what is life really about, and what is needed, what changes are needed to take place. So I think that as I talk, I feel I'm living through an incredibly important part of history where this is a time of great consciousness expansion. Because the shock, if it doesn't destroy us, it can really wake us up. And that's the point of becoming more conscious. We're becoming more awake, less asleep to who we are. In fact, what helps us wake up is to realize of how asleep we are and how narrow and superficial are the normal lives that we live. But it can be painful because as we wake up, we also find ourselves being stripped of our illusions. I started on this spiritual awakening path many years ago, and I thought, wow, it's great. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to be more awake and more alive. And to start with, I began to feel that as I learned to meditate and do other things. Then I also had to discover how unconscious I was, how full of prejudices I was, how I had a dark side that I didn't know about, and that I had to explore my capacity to be manipulative, to use charm, to seduce people to my way of seeing the world. I had to explore and open up to some very not particularly nice parts of myself. So this is what happens as we become more aware. We begin to shine the light of new knowing down into the subterranean caverns of our being and see those denizens, those sloths that sort of live down there. And that means work. As I said at the beginning, the lucky old acorn just turns into an oak tree of its own. But you and I ain't so lucky. We've got to work to expand our consciousness. And again, we need to find out how to work. What do we do? How do I become more conscious? Because there's many, many different ways. What works for us? Well, I put five. I put 1, 2, 3, 5. Yeah, 5 important things. The first is psychotherapy, and I suppose I'm a little bit prejudiced as I started off trained as a psychotherapist. But if we want to be more conscious, we have to discover how wounded we are. We need to come to see how much and where we carry wounds from our childhood and traumas. If our inner child was wounded, because that sort of stunts us and it makes us hesitate from being willing to expand ourselves. So psychotherapy is one part of the journey. Psychotherapy, we explore our dark side, we find out more about our personality selves. As I said earlier, if Blair had gone to a psychotherapist, he may not have gone to war in Iraq. So my second absolutely key thing is meditation. And in my book on Awakening the Universal Heart that came out in 2013, I had a whole chapter on meditation, about 12 pages. And I'm sure you all know about meditation, but I will simply say that there's many different kinds, and it quietens the mind. And when our mind is not so agitated and we become quieter, the space for our heart to open up and for our soul nature to come to the fore, and we can begin to get out of our personality selves, our ego-centered self, and we can begin to find a deeper us, to give birth to a deeper us. My third thing is prayer. Prayer is very important, especially at this time of crisis. We need to pray because prayer is a direct connection with the higher forces in the world, or the spiritual forces. It's a kind of a dialogue with the sacred. And often things don't happen to us because we don't ask for them. If I have a friend and I'd like him to lend me a fiver, I need to say, hey mate, excuse me, can you lend me a fiver? And he'll either, and he'll say, yeah, Serge, I'll lend you a fiver. But if I don't ask him, he won't just come and give me a fiver. And in the same way as we need to ask for what we need at this level, that's important, so in the higher dimensions of existence, which we begin to become more aware of as our consciousness expands, we also need to ask for help from these higher levels of consciousness. And in the Bible, we read, knock and it shall open, ask and ye shall receive. Well, it's very important to ask for help in our spiritual journey. Ask for courage when we're having to go down and face our dark side. And a lot of people at this moment of the coronavirus, where there's a lot of death around and a lot of fear and uncertainty, we all need to be doing a lot of prayer to be asked to be given the strength and the compassion and the love to sort of go through this painful rite of passage into what I believe will be our deeper humanity. And then, of course, there's all those spiritual activities like yoga, tai chi, and qigong, which awaken different aspects of us. And then there is the use of psychoactive plants, or ayahuasca, or LSD, which open up the doors of perception. Now, I have used ayahuasca quite a few times, and I found it a very, very important awakening tool. I'm going to call things like ayahuasca or LSD transformational technologies. And I think they just need to be used occasionally so that we can have a sense of what it is that we're awakening into. My first ayahuasca trip, I really had a very, very powerful experience of existing inside the heart of God. That was very important for me because all my reading and all my sort of meditation was somehow confirmed by this experience. It was like I was given a sort of little extra trip into higher levels of consciousness. It didn't mean that I lived there, but I just had a little insight into grace. I was given a little soupçon of grace. And I just want to say that if you feel very anti this, and many people do, then, please have nothing to do with it. But if you just feel you need a little extra help, then so long as it's done in a sacred setting with a guide and someone to help you, and you know the dosage of everything, and it's not done in a hippie way and you get high and go to a concert, that is irresponsible. But if it's done in a responsible way, it can be very helpful. So then we are now embarked on our path. And in my work, I try to work as a spiritual educator who uses psychotherapy, because I don't see a separation between spirituality and psychotherapy. I see that they both address different dimensions of the awakening, process. Okay, so how do we know what to use, what to do, how to become more awake? Because what works for one person may not work for another. I remember I did a 10-day sort of Buddhist meditation retreat from many years ago. It didn't work for me because my way is not the way of doing Buddhism. I also tried to learn the Chinese Qigong. It didn't work for me either because that was not my way. But Buddhism and Qigong may work for other people. So we need to find what it is that works for us. And sometimes, to start off with, we need to try sort of one or two wares on offer to see, to see if they're the right thing for us. Also, we need to realize that what once may have served us at one level may not serve us anymore when we move to another level. And a teacher of mine, John Bennett, spoke in his autobiography that I really recommend you read, called Witness. In fact, there's two spiritual autobiographies I really recommend. Witness by John Bennett and Yogananda's sort of famous, I've forgotten the name of it, but his famous, autobiography of a yogi. Both very, very important. But sort of Bennett told the story how he practiced a particular spiritual technique of breathing and how it was wonderful for him. And he went around, sort of saying, you all have to do this, it's been so great. But then he began to discover that this technique that served him so well began to operate against him and was the worst thing, and was absolutely the worst thing for him. And he also found that some of those people that he recommended it to, they did not have good effects. So that if we find something that works for us, we need to know when to stop doing it. And just because something is good for one person does not mean that it's good for us. What really is our task in becoming more self-conscious, more awake? I think we've got to find new stories, new myths to live by that are more expansive, that are more human-friendly, that are more planet-friendly than the myths that we grew up with. I grew up with a story that told me that because I'm white-skinned, I'm superior, that because my parents had a bit of money, and I went to good schools and a posh university, that I was superior to those who hadn't. I mean, what an inhuman way, sort of, what an inhuman story. And it never resonated with me. And my journey into discovering a deeper Serge happened as I realized I didn't want to dance to the drumbeat of those kinds of stories. That the point was to get a good job in a bank and be rich and have a big house in the country and, forget about the rest of humanity. So that leads me to another very important aspect of awakening our consciousness. It's through service, being of service. My first book, Awakening the Universal Heart, Guidelines for the Spiritual Activist, was about service. We need to help our fellow human beings. We need to remember that we're not islands unto ourselves and that we have to support and honor our fellow human beings who are less fortunate than us, especially in this time of the coronavirus. And so finding our own way to be a change agent or to make a difference in life is very important because it helps our soul life, the deeper us, to come more into expression. And the more expanded we become, the better we become at integrating difficult experiences and working through blockages that keep us operating at a low level. I wrote down 5. I wrote down 6 blockages that we will often experience. The first is a fear of the unknown. As we journey into new levels of consciousness, we let go, we move out of our familiar terrain, and we go into uncharted waters, and that can be scary. And so we resist it. The second thing is that we need to see that there's a part of us that resists change and that wants to stay as we've always been. I always say to some of my clients that we have a prayer, oh, please God, may I change and have my life be great, have fantastic relationships, earn all the money I can, feel happy and enlightened, live a great life, but may I not have to change anything that I'm already doing in my life. Folks, ain't gonna work. But we need to see the resistor and or the saboteur, and how subtle it can often be. And the point is that if we have not integrated some part of our early childhood, say we have a traumatized inner child who was hurt or dishonored at, say, the age of 3, when we grow up, this child will want our attention, will want to be healed inside us. And so whenever we're just moving forward, he'll come in and he'll put a spanner in the works. He will sort of sabotage us. So we need to really see that part of us that can self-sabotage. The other point of the blockage is that society around us, or the system, exists at a rather low level, and we don't want to go against the grain because we might not be liked. And in the culture we live in, working on oneself or doing inner work is not particularly kosher. When I talk to some of my old university friends, they say, "What do you do all the day, Serge? You don't go out to a job, you lazy old devil." And I say, I'm working on myself. They say, what a waste of time. Don't be taken in. Honor the truth inside your own heart. And that's why finding your heart and awakening your heart is so very, 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 very important. Because when we can awaken this part of ourselves, heal the wounds inside our heart, we have much more access to our love and our compassion and our wisdom and our creativity. So the other part, that the other blockage, is what I talked about earlier, is that we have a shadow side. And the shadow part of you and I is that part of us that we don't know that we have. I know that I can be manipulative. That's not my shadow. I know that I'm lazy. That's not my shadow. My shadow is what I don't know about myself, and which my wife experiences in relationship with me and reflects back to me. Okay, so those are some of the blockages that we may need to work with. But there's 6 things that are key if we want to move forward, and at least 3 of them need to be done at one time or another. The first is we really want to evolve so that we take this game seriously, so that awakening our consciousness is not just, something that we do the occasional evening. We go to a talk by some Indian guru, and now I've awakened my consciousness, yet we continue living our old lives. We've really got to want to. There needs to be a commitment. There needs to be a strong intention. The second thing is that we need to find out how best to do so and have the energy to put our intentions into action. And here, often, once we start on the path, we will draw synchronistic events to happen to us. Synchronicity has been very important in my life. All the most important teachers and books that have come into my life have come purely, synchronistically. The most important things have happened, just by chance. A friend insisted on inviting me to a party that I hadn't been invited to, and his wife said, "Look, Serge, look, Chris, you can't invite Serge to this party. It'll be rude to the neighbours." Chris said, "I don't know why, but I'm going to invite Serge. I'm going to bring him along." And he did, and it was at that party I met my wonderful wife. So I believe that great synchronicities happen, and that the more we tune into who we are, the more we allow a synchronistic universe to open for us. And the other 3 things are what I've mentioned. We need to do meditation, and we need to do prayer, and we need to be of service. Now, I believe there's certain help substances that we also need, that it's difficult to do it all on our own, and that there is help out there. I happen to believe, my friends, you may not, but it's just my experience, that we live in a universe that is far greater and more dimensional than we can see. And I believe that there's beings who exist at higher levels of consciousness, our spirit guides who work with us, our master teachers, that we can ask for their help. I spoke about that earlier, but it's really, really important. Ask and ye shall receive. Some of you may feel at some stage in your journey that you want to go and see a guru. They're very important. I spoke about the importance of a spiritual teacher again in my first book, Awakening the Universal Heart, because if we can be in the presence of someone who is really awakened, it can have an awakening effect on us. We're not going to stay there, but we can have an experience to know what it is to be more fully awake than we normally are. And it's the same thing, as I said, with a psychedelic drug. Just because we have an expanded consciousness experience does not mean that we live there, but that we've had an experience so we know and we can take it in, so we know what to aim for. I've sat at the feet of quite a few gurus and shamans in my time, and they've been very important. I've learned things from them. And we can also go to sacred sites because they hold a certain spiritual power. I was at Chartres Cathedral sort of last year, and I sat and meditated by the rose window, and I felt an extraordinary spiritual sort of presence, and I felt that I was being helped. We need to do rituals. Again, I wrote about ritual in my book. They're very important because rituals evoke sacred energy. So, now, I just want to say, something about the consciousness path that we choose. There's set paths, i.e., we join a Buddhist group, we join a Sufi group, we join a sort of Christian group, or we're eclectic. And we just have the sense that I will go with whatever I draw to me at any particular time. Now, I've always been eclectic because that for me has been free, and because I realized that at different times I've needed different teachers and teachings, and so I have felt free to draw to me what I needed at any particular time. But the downside of choosing to be eclectic is that one does a little bit of everything and you don't get into anything in detail. And I've been guilty of that at times in my life. Now, if you choose a particular spiritual path, the upside of it is that you have a whole tradition behind you that helps you, that you've got a sort of force sort of behind you. If you become a Catholic, then there's a great force in, Catholicism through the ages. The downside is that there may be distortions in it, and that the traditions belong more to the past, and there may be sort of woundedness in the tradition, and particular with Catholicism. We see the huge amount of child abuse that has happened at the hands of pedophiliac priests. And it's very interesting. I was reading a book about the Dalai Lama. He's the most wonderful man, but he has certain old-fashioned ideas. For example, he still believes that homosexuality is wrong and bad, and it's against sacred law. So that's the downside of being on a particular spiritual path. Now, I think the seven main paths that that we can be on, and each of them are a little bit different, and we can be sort of mainly on one and a little bit on two or even three of the others. And here are the paths. The first is the way of beauty, all things bright and beautiful. This is very much the path of my wife. She loves to beautify things. She beautifies our sort of houses. She can't bear the mess of my office and is always sort of beautifying it. So I have these two nice pictures behind which she hung up. All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. It's a wonderful path. Then there's the path of action, of service in the world, doing things, being of service. Then there's the path of illumination and contemplation. It's the path of yogis and sages. Then there's the path of dance and ritual. It's the path that magicians go and a lot of performers and those who like these esoteric mystery schools. Then there's the path of science, transformation through awe. There's the path of devotion. Its prayer is the main vehicle, a fiery love for God. And then there's the way of will, those brave ones, the pioneers and the explorers. Sort of Martin Luther King was a pioneer and an explorer. And each path has its own challenges and difficulties. And some paths teach higher consciousness skills and leave out others. For example, the martial arts, it focuses on power at the exclusion of compassion. If we're on the path of action, then, and we're also on the path of devotion, we have a little bit of devotionality. It's good because people who are too, I've got to change the world, I've got to do this, I've got to act, can be too obsessive, and if they're also devotional and prayerful, then it can soften them, and they are not going to be so possessed by that archetype of action. The path of devotion is the most human of all, and God is the friend to be adored. It's a fiery love. We love the divine in all our obstacles and enemies. We forget our little self, and it falls away, our little ego self, by no longer being energized. And prayer is central to this path. But all paths have a particular dark side. The dark side of the devotional path is fanaticism, and Islamic, fundamentalism is really, they're extremely devoted to fighting for the Prophet, but there's a terrible downside of sort of killing. And the way of action, sort of, the danger of this path is that you turn into a workaholic. So there's no time for oneself or one's family, and one thinks of those Christian missionaries who sort of went to Africa to convert the African people to Christianity, and they would just abandon their own families. Now, I think the last where we're going to come to an end soon, but I just want to say a few more things. That it's very important that the body is taken along in our transformational journey. Our body is our temple. All my life I've really done a lot of exercise and a lot of sport, and I've tried to keep my body in, fit and in good shape. In fact, just before giving this talk, I did an hour's terrific workout, and I feel all the better for it. So don't neglect the body. Don't think that being spiritual, that there's a separation between mind and body, because the more we awaken, the more we realize that mind and body and feelings and spirit, that they're all interconnected. And it's no good just working on the side of yourself that you're already good at and becoming better at that if this side is lacking, and sort of this side needs moving up, because and one can think of a lot of highly evolved people who are evolved in one area of their life, but in other areas of their life they've not evolved. I could talk about the spiritual teacher Osho, who wrote the most wonderful books and had a most hypnotic way of speaking. And he helped many, many people of the sannyasis who worked with him. And I've known many of them who spoke about him with great respect, and I have great respect for Osho. But there was also a side of him that was undeveloped, his emotional side. And so he didn't always practice what he preached. And so he came to a rather sticky end, which again, if he had done inner work on the less evolved sides of his nature, he could have been perhaps a more full human being. So I'm just going to talk about two things that we need to avoid, and then I'm going to stop. One is, my friend John Welwood talked about a process called spiritual bypassing, i.e., you think that being spiritual, having a higher consciousness, that you don't need to go through all the different layers, that you can just jump up there and know it. And some people will take LSD and have an extraordinary experience, and they say, wow, I'm enlightened, I'm fantastic. And then the experience wears off and they realize that it's all a myth, that they've just seen, they've moved into a higher world, but they haven't been a resident, they haven't lived there, they've just had a brief experience of it. So beware of feeling that you can bypass the lower rungs of the consciousness awakening, because you can't. And if you try to do so, it is at your peril. The last thing I want to say is that one can overstay one's time on the lower rungs of the consciousness ladder and not move up when you're ready to do it, i.e., that you can be a little bit timid. And here, what you need to meditate is probably on the quality of courage. So I'll just say this, that as we evolve, the rules of the game change, because we move into and inhabit different layers, higher layers of consciousness, and certain things become easier for us than they were when we existed on the lower rungs of consciousness. I quoted earlier Martin Luther King's remark about sort of, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. On the lower rungs, we don't have boots. On the higher rungs, it's much easier to do that. Like when I was 20, I had a painful experience of being left by a girl I loved. Well, I didn't really have the capacity to deal with it very well because I was pretty immature and I went into a sort of victim, desperate, the end of the world was coming mode because I didn't have the consciousness to deal with it. So the rules of my game at that level, that they were very fleeting. Now, if the same thing happened, I have more awareness, I have more inner strength, I'd be able to deal with it. And actually, a big crisis happened a few years ago, and I dealt with it reasonably well because I'm stronger than I used to be. And I think that that's important today. We're in a challenging world, and we need to build up our spiritual strength and capacity so that we can face this difficult situation that we're facing. We don't know what's going to happen. Is our financial system going to collapse? Is is there going to be a second wave of this pandemic? We don't know. And the point is that if we stay strong in our hearts, then it's important that we have a very positive view of the future. In my last book, Gateways to the Soul, Inner Work for the Outer World, I have a very positive vision, and I'm going to hold to that vision because I know that if we hold to a positive vision, that then that positive vision is going to come into expression. So, my friends, be brave, be positive, and see that we may be going through a collective dark night of the soul, but please remember this: there's always light at the end of the tunnel, and dark clouds always have a silver lining. Thank you very much.